Okay. Real quick before I dive into anything, if anybody has any questions before we get going, it's very important you pay attention to this stuff because it's going to get trickier, right? Conditional statements is one of those units that can be very challenging for some students to grasp. So I want to go slow enough. It's hard enough to do it when you guys are in class. To do it over remote learning might be even trickier. So let's start with this. This is our checklist for the unit. This unit called conditional statements. Now in part 1 of this unit, I checked off most of this list, right? That conditional statements is really just a big fancy word for making decisions, and making decisions is a big part of programming. We talked about these relational operators, and I'll go over that in a minute, what an if statement is, what code blocks are, what an else statement is, and how if and else relate to one another. Let me put it to you this way, okay? Here's kind of a summary of what we learned in part 1. First off, let's talk about these ideas of comparing things right here. So when I say we're comparing things, okay, what I'm talking about here is those symbols that we borrow from mathematics: less than, greater than, equal to. Now, mathematics kind of borrows them from the way we talk as well. Like we say things like that, like, hey, you have more candy than me, give me some candy. Or we're equal players in soccer, I'm as equal as you are. Or I'm greater than you are at playing Pokemon. I don't know, whatever you guys do. But you get the idea. We talk about those things all the time to compare one thing with another thing. And it essentially creates what I'll call a test. We're testing to see if one thing compares with another thing. Is this thing greater than this thing? Is this thing equal to this thing, for example? So we learned that we have to use special symbols in our code because some of the symbols we're used to in math class aren't easily typed when we get to the coding part. So that was the first part of the unit, was learning those symbols. Then we learned our first if statement to decide one thing. We wrote this if statement where we took one item and compared it to another item, okay? And if when it compared it, the test was true, it would run the code here that we called a block of code. A block of code is said to be code between two curly brackets. This is all from part 1, okay? So a couple tips with this. Now that we're writing these if statements, we're writing the words if and eventually writing the word else. These are special keywords in programming languages, but they also make use of a lot of brackets, both rounded off brackets and curly brackets. So it gets a lot more technical looking as you start to write these if statements. It's not as just writing words, you're actually putting a lot more symbols into it. And so combine that with the symbols you learned in the other units, it's getting to definitely look more like quote unquote code now, okay? You'll also learn and have learned, if you've been working on this, that if statements used when they do the code, it indents the code. This will help you visualize that a block of code is taking place. But the good news is programs like Visual Studio will help you to write all this stuff. Then we wrapped up part 1 by deciding 2 things, whether it's true or it's false. And that's where we brought in the else. So there's if combined with else. And now again, it's getting even more complicated to write these little pieces of code down and stuff like that, but not impossible. So today we start taking a look at part 2 of this unit, okay? Part 2 of conditional statements. And as you may have saw from the checklist, let me jump back. So in the checklist, there's really not much for part 2. The use of something called else if and something called nesting. And then random numbers, which is really cool, actually has nothing to do with if statements. So it's just something I'm going to use in one of the assignments. So I'm going to teach you about random numbers today. Plus, you need random numbers if you're going to do anything cool with your code in the future. So that's where we're at. Okay, all right. So we already seen this. We've already seen the idea of a conditional statement and how it can make code be either true or false, right? But what if we had multiple conditions, right? Not everything that we decide is one thing or the other. Sometimes, like, for example, if someone said to you, what's your favorite band? There's multiple things to choose from, right? So you're not just making one decision, we're deciding amongst multiple things. So here's an example. Let's say you're writing code, and this isn't our example, but let's say this was the one we were doing, where you would enter in to a text box a grade. So you can see that up here. Where they type in a number. One sec. Excuse me. That would represent their grade. And then it would display kind of what letter grade they would get. So maybe they would get an A. And I would put that into one of those message boxes that we learned about in part 1. Okay, so here you can see if their grade was greater than or equal to 90, then I'd say they get an A. If their grade was greater than or equal to 80, I'd give them a B. So what I'm doing for this is I'm having a if statement, checking to see if their grade is equal to 90, and then different if statements checking different numbers. So for example, down here, this one's checking to see if it's greater than or equal to 60. And then it's telling them they're getting a D. So this worked great when the grade was 51, because it says they just passed. Because let's see how that would go. Well, 51 is not greater than 90, so this would not show up. A 51 is not greater than 80, so this would not show up. Wouldn't show up here. Wouldn't show up here. None of these tests would pass. Comes down to the last test. 51 is greater than 50. So that's why this message box is popping up. This is the one if statement that's true. That's why it worked. But what happens when I type in a 91? Well, 91 is greater than 90. But 91 is also greater than 80 and greater than 70. So when a 91 is entered, all of those message boxes will show up. And that's not what I wanted to have happen. So in order to fix this, I'm going to introduce the idea of something called nesting, or a nested if. And a nested if is, well, it's not that. Let me talk about what a nested if is, okay? So when you hear the word nesting, as you just saw in that very corny cartoon, you can think of a bird nest, but also I'd like to point out, I found this just a few minutes before class started on the Bricks website. They have these coffee tables called nesting coffee tables. And then a lot of us know, living in Manitoba, there's a large Ukrainian and Russian community here, and very much part of their culture is these sometimes called Ukrainian or Russian dolls, where one doll is inside another doll is inside another doll. All of these embrace the concept of nesting, putting something inside of something else, or underneath, or into, okay? So how does this mean, what does this mean for coding? Well, nesting means you're going to place an if statement inside of another if statement. So kind of you're seeing a visual of it here. But let's see how that would look in the example we did before. So placing an if inside of another if. This is how the code would look. And because of all the indenting, because of all the curly brackets, it can really get to be a nasty looking piece of code, because one thing gets indented, then another thing gets indented, and all these curly brackets to manage. So nested if statements are useful, but there is a slightly better way, which I'm going to teach you next. But these nested if statements will work. So let me show you how it would work. So let's say again, I entered 91. Well, the first if statement is true. So it's going to show the message box saying you get an A. One sec. It's dusty in here today. So because that is true, like with any if else, if the if is true, the else is not true. So all of the code inside of else doesn't run, which is a huge chunk of code. So only the first message box shows. Now, what happens if that's not true? What if it's like the number, say, 81? Well, 81 is not greater than 90. So now it goes to the else and it hits another if statement. Now, this one is true. 81 is true. So all of its code doesn't run, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with nesting is, especially for a beginning programmer, is it's really tricky to follow. And there's a lot of indenting and it's really easy to miss a bracket. And as much as Visual Studio wants to help you, it can get really overwhelming. So good news. Instead of doing that, we're going to combine the words if and else together and create something called an else if. Okay, it is two words, but sometimes it's said as if it's one word, else if. Okay, now how an else if works is it's like an if statement, but it has the word else at the front and then another test. So it incorporates a second test or a third test. So what happens is it comes to the first test. And if this is true, it runs this piece of code, but doesn't run any other code. However, if this test is false, then it comes and does the second test. If this test is true, then it runs this code, and obviously it wasn't running this code, and it won't run any other code, just the one that tests true. So it's a little trickier to follow, but the way else if works, you can see right here. And let me just back that up a bit. Whoops. Okay. It looks a lot simpler, even though it's still fairly complicated. It still has lots of curly brackets, but not as much indenting going on. Okay. There actually isn't, there's a lot less curly brackets as well. But basically think of it as a multiple decision, almost like a ladder or like a bunch of switches that it goes through. So if it's 90, you get an A. So it picks the one that's true, right? Is this one true? Is this one true? Whichever one is true, it goes to. And it doesn't go to the other ones. And you can also, as an option, add an else at the end of it. You don't have to have an else. And I'll just switch back to what I had here for these options. So in the first one I showed you, there was one test and then a second test. But you can add as many else ifs as you want. You could add 1 million of them to your code. Else if, else if, else if, else if. And you can decide as many things as you want. In other words, else if decides anything more than 2 things. Also with an else if, you have an option to put an else at the end. You don't have to. What the else would signify is, well, do this test, do this test, do this test. If it fails all of the tests, then just do this code right here where the else is. Okay? And that's what an else if statement is. Okay. In reality, what that means now is, I'm just going to back up here for a sec. I can now put a check mark, although we haven't done it in our example, on this thing here. You've learned about both else if and about nesting. And really, that's everything you need to know about this unit called conditional statements. However, okay, a little bit more. So for those of you who are feeling a little more confident, I'm going to show you the next slide, although for most of you, I don't recommend this at all, okay? Coding is hard enough, and learning where brackets go and how to indent. And for some of you, you might be losing a few marks on the style of your code because you're leaving too many spaces. So in the next slide, what I'm going to show you, I don't recommend at all. However, the fact is, for some of you who are getting a little more confident in your coding, as it says on this not recommended slide, if the code inside of a block of code is only one line, curly brackets can actually be eliminated. You don't have to use them. And you can also, as a second option, bring the code right up to the same line as the if statement itself. So what you're seeing here on the screen in code is exactly the same code as this, which is actually exactly the same code as this. So this is where we started. Then an else if made it look a little cleaner, and this makes it even smaller, but that doesn't make it better. It just makes it smaller and a little more tricky to write, which is why I don't really recommend it. Okay, how's our time? 2:24. So that's pretty good for timing right now. All right. So remember, I don't want to finish this today. I want to finish the presentation part today. I don't want to finish necessarily the example today. I want to get a good start on the example. But before we start the example today is going to use random numbers. So let's just talk for a minute about random numbers. So random numbers are useful for most things that a computer does that you want a randomness to it, okay? Which obviously includes things like video games. If you're taking this course and planning to move towards something like that, which why I would take this course. That's super fun. Then you got to learn about random numbers, because random numbers is the beginning of how these things work. I mean, even if you think about board games where you roll dice, rolling dice is what a random number is. Drawing a card out of a deck is essentially a random number. So random numbers are the basis of many things that a computer does. So built into the programming language C# is some ways to do this. It's what's called a built-in function. Now, a function is also something that you hear about in math class sometimes, or haven't maybe yet, but it appears in certain grade 10 math courses. Doesn't matter, this isn't a math course. Yeah. But how it essentially works is it will generate for you a random number between 0 and 1, okay? Or in the case of the code you're seeing here, it will just generate some random integer. So we're going to do this in our example. So I'm not going to go over too much detail what you're seeing on the screen right now, but you're going to write a really neat line of code, random equals new random. And then you will generate the random number by saying, give me the next one. And you'll get the hang of the code on how that works. So here you can see in the example here in the notes, it has just generated this big, massive, what is that at? 677 million would be the random number there. Which is neat, but not necessarily useful. What if I'm making a dice game? I don't need a million. I need a number between, say, 1 and 6. So if that's the case, you can change how it generates the random number. In this case, I'm generating a random number between 10 and what looks to be 100. If you see these two numbers on the screen right here, between 10 and 100. But in reality, see in our example, it's actually a little bit less than that. It's actually 1 less than this. That's just the way it works, okay? Now, what if I want to generate a decimal number? Well, you can do that too, right? They also have an ability to generate a random decimal number. And it can get even more complicated. There's a formula for generating random numbers. If you take the Computer Science 30S course, I go into more detail on that. I mean, it's like a science thing, right? Formulas are part of science, but I'm going to move on from that. We're going to see this in the example today, okay? We're going to see how you can, there is examples as you can see here in the notes, but the example we're going to do will do this better. We'll also in the example today access a piece of code called form load. Some of you have already maybe seen this a little bit. Form load is the code that runs when a form first appears on the screen. And you'll see how we do that and where that goes today in the example and tomorrow in the example, okay? One last thing before we start our example. For those, again, of you who are feeling a little more confident, this is not required in your code, but you can actually combine logic using 3 special ways to join logic together. And the 3 ways are explained in 3 words: and, or, and not, okay? So let me move towards this. Again, this is for those of you maybe feeling a little more advanced. And in C#, those are represented by those 3 symbols you can see on the screen right now. The not you've seen before with not equals. It's the exclamation point. It means not. The or is the 2 vertical lines, and the and is the 2 ampersand symbols. We will put those into today's example, and I'll write some comments to explain it, okay? So the way it works is the way it would work logically, right? You could say something like, well, I'll go to school today if it's a school day and my mom worries about me, being marked absent. Both of those have to be true with the word and. Now with the word or, if I said, well, I'll go to school today if it's raining out, or maybe I'll go to school today if I've got nothing to do at home today, or maybe I have a test. So one of those 2 things can be true. They don't have to both be true. So and or can combine logic in different ways. It's hard for me to explain it without an example. So that's good news, because it is time to start our example. All right, guys, here's what I want you to make, okay? And I realize we're working over remote here, so I can't give you guys too long to build this. But basically, if I count it up, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 labels. Count that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 labels. So Let me jump to mine right now. I'm going to jump to my Visual Studio. Okay, so I'm going to take my toolbox and I'm going to put on there 5 labels. I'm going to worry about what's in them in a minute, but I'm just going to appear to label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 labels. 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to need 2 text boxes. 1, 2 text boxes. Okay, go down to text box. 1, 2. You're going to need 1 button. Button. So 5 labels, 2 text boxes, 1 button. That's what you need. Okay? That's what we're going to need for this thing. Now, you can start building this design out. It's pretty simple. Don't worry too much about the text here. Some of this text is just explaining stuff. Let me back up and just put wish I could freeze that. 1 sec. I'd make it so that I could freeze that. Can I do that? Oh, guys. Kids. Can I do this? I think I can. Oh, maybe I cannot. Okay, whatever. So I'm cheater chattering right now, but one of them is going to say guess a number between 1 and 5. So you're going to select one of your labels. Say my label 1. Now I'm going to bring up my properties window. And into my properties window, I'm going to type guess a number between 1 and 5. Okay? So that'll be on there. Guess a number between 1 and 5. Your next label will say first guess was. Then I have a ... which is not really that necessary, but I'm going to say first guess was ... Okay, so that's on another label. Then I have one that says guess a number between 1 and 3. My third label, guess a number between 1 and 3. And then I don't have to jump back. The next label is going to say second guess was ... And then the last label will just say number of guesses equals. Number of guesses equals. Okay. On our button, it will say guess. And then our text boxes, they don't have anything in them. Okay. So in order to see this, and again, whatever you say at the top here of the form, I don't care. It doesn't have to say anything, but I'm going to just put in there that it's conditional statements. Example 2. Okay. I'm going to have mine start. And again, that's really it. That's all you really need to do for a design. It doesn't have to look pretty. I'm just going to, so that when we run it, I'm going to have mine go in the center of the screen. I'm going to set the form border style just so it's a little bit fixed. I'm going to select all my buttons and labels and text boxes, and I'm going to make the font a little bigger so it's easier for you guys to see it on the screen. Let's see, I'll jack it up to 26. I think I can make it a little bigger than that. 36. Let's try that. Sure. Okay, and then I'm just going to kind of space things out. So guess a number between 1 and 5, which will have a text box beside it. Then I'll have guess a number between 1 and 3, and it'll have a text box beside it. Oh no, those two down because I have to have first guess was here. And this one. And then second guess was, the number of guesses equals, and then my guess button. And again, how they space out, how this actually looks is not that important to me. What's important is that you guys have a design, okay? I'm just trying to make mine bigger so that it's easier for you guys to see this. When it, I think I might have accidentally double clicked, yeah. When it gets built, or when it runs, pardon me. Here we go. I'm gonna, this is not necessary, but it'll make it a little easier to see when it runs. I'm gonna change some colors here. These two, I'm gonna change the foreground color so they're not the same color. So I'm gonna make them like a dark blue. And I'm gonna make this one also a different foreground color. Like a dark auburn there. Okay, so that's gonna be my design. Now, the names of these things. You can see the list of them there, right? So I'll leave that list up in a second, but I'm gonna go and just do mine right now. So I'm gonna take this label and go to its name and type in what the name of this thing, which is LBL for label, info for information 1. To be honest, this label, if you didn't name it, wouldn't make a difference. I'm going to hit escape and I'm going to leave it just called label 1 for a second. The labels that matter, because our code's going to change, is this one and this one and this one. So the one that says first guess was, this is an important one to name. So I'm going to call it LBL first. The one where the second guess goes, that's an important label to name. I'm going to call it LBL second. And this one where the number of guesses goes, I'm going to call LBL number. So these 3 labels, it's super important that you set the name for those 3 labels. This label and this label, it won't really matter that much. That being said, I'm going to name them LBL info 1 and LBL info 2. Information. Both text boxes need to be named, and that's important because they're going to be used. So txtFirst, txtSecond. Now we had labels called first and second. How it can distinguish them is one starts with txt for text box, and the labels start with LBL. And now, hopefully naming these things, which we did all the way back in our second unit, is going to get way easier for you guys. This is a way easier process than it was the first time you did this. And then finally, my button, I'm going to name BTN Guess. Again, that one doesn't matter as much. As well, your form doesn't really matter as much if you name it, but I'm going to. And now I'm going to check the drop down at the top here. Oops. And I can see all my things now have their proper names. That my text box has a proper name, my 2 labels have proper names, my 5 labels. My button has a proper name, and even my form all have proper names that start with 3 letters so that when I get to coding, I don't have to go back and check what I named things. As long as I remember those 3 letters, I'll never have to go back and look at the design anymore. I'm going to run it once just to make sure that my design actually appears properly. And I think it should, I hope it should. A sip of my ice cap, which is completely melted. I feel so sad. Maybe not completely. There it is. There's my design up and running. 2 text boxes I can type in and a button I couldn't click, which doesn't do anything yet. All right. That's what our design looks like. That's what the names are. And I think that's where we'll stop today. Well, maybe we should write a little bit of code. Maybe just a little. Yeah, I think just a little to set up for tomorrow. So I'm changing my mind. Okay, whether you finish your design or not, I want you to jump to the code for the guess button. Okay? If you accidentally clicked other things, don't worry about that stuff. That stuff can just go away. Okay? And by the way, now you're going to see how I can fix that, because I've fixed that for a lot of you students. For those of you who are kind of getting the hang of this, all I'm doing is commenting out and putting the little comment mark at the front of the lines that are causing an issue. So if this line is causing an issue, I'm commenting that line out. It's a very simple process till finally my design is back. Okay? That way, if I don't want to delete the line of code, because that could cause other problems if I accidentally delete too much. So I just turn it into a comment. That way, if I need it back, I can fix it quickly. I can quickly get back to fixing it. Okay. So speaking of comments, we're now going to put in the code for the guess button. This is where that code is going to go, right? Now that we know what a comment is, that's handy that we can put that in there. And let's just discuss what it's going to do, okay? And again, you don't have to put these comments in for your example, but what it's going to do is it's going to pick two random numbers at the start of this program. In other words, when the form first appears, it'll have picked two random numbers. When they click the guess button, we will read the two numbers out of the two text boxes. Well, the user will type in numbers in the text boxes and see if they get the numbers correct. Which means, what that means is we make a decision, which means we're going to be writing an if statement. What are you doing? Okay, so this is a sort of a comment explaining what this program is going to do. So for it to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back to our design. And what I'm going to have you do is double click your form. Now, before you do this, you got to be very careful. If I double click right here, I might end up double clicking my label, which is not what I want. I want to double click the form. Even if I try here in the middle, I might accidentally double click on something I didn't know was there. So it is tricky to find a spot on your form that you know is not hidden by something else. I usually recommend somewhere down in the bottom corner, not the top corners. Those don't work, believe it or not. Oh, maybe they do. So once you double click it, you should see code that says load. And then right here will be the name of your form. If you didn't name your form, it'll probably just say form 1 right here. So this is the code that runs before the form appears. You get to it by double clicking form. Okay. So why don't we just say hi? Message box show hi. Time to guess. This is the code called message box. We saw this in part 1 of this unit. You'll need it to do the first programming problem in this unit and the second. You might have also seen it in the case study at the end of the variables unit. It is a pretty simple line of code. And as you can see, when I run this code right now, the message box will appear before my form appears. Okay, that's the form load code. And that's where I'm going to put that. Now, one other quick thing before we wrap up today. We're going to scroll up and make a couple of global variables. Okay. Global variables, as you now hopefully know, are underneath the words public partial class. If you remember, we made them in part 1 as well in the first example. So we're going to make int number 1, that's gonna be our first number, equals 0. Int number 2 equals 0. Int guesses equals 0. Okay. Now that you've had a whole unit on variables, making variables shouldn't be as tricky as it was the first time. And that's where I'm going to wrap up today. I'm going to wrap up right there. Tomorrow, we're going to dive into more of this code. We'll have the class tomorrow to work on this. We took the class today to get started, and a lot of this was theory behind what we're doing here. Okay. The theory behind this, I'm just going to leave that up there for a little bit, just for those of you who are building that design. And at this point, I'll say to those of you, thank you for staying on with me today, right? Good job. It's now time that if you guys can log off. I know I used up the period today. It's been a while since I did that. But you guys can now log off. You're welcome to stay on if you have any questions in the last few minutes of class, or if you're still working on your example and trying to follow along. You can also follow this example along on my website. It's on there, or on videos on my website. And again, like I said at the beginning of class, if you're having trouble or you need help or you need guidance or you're not sure, ask me, email me, anything I can do to help, guys. It's tough enough to get through remote learning where you guys are now. So anything I can do to help, I'm glad to do so. The programs are going to get more interesting now, but it's definitely getting harder. So let me help you along the way. All right, everybody, have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Have a good one.
Friday tomorrow of a long weekend.
In case you don't look at your other monitor, by the way, there's people in the chat.
Working.
Have a good one, though.
Oh, kids, anyway. My computer speaker stopped working. I saw one of you guys was trying to talk and I didn't hear it. Speaker went to sleep. I gotta go wake it up. Okay, I think it's awake now. I think it's awake. Maybe not. Oh well, I gotta shut off the video. Maybe it's the video that caused it. And stop recording. Okay.